Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we're taking a somewhat nostalgic trip back in time looking at Gelid's Tranquillo Rev4, kindly donated by WildBill. Keep watching to find out more. Okay, so in today's video the main crux of it is we're going to be testing this against the current Intel stock cooler based on the LGA 1200 socket. Now, obviously, this is going to be considerably better than a standard stock cooler, even one of Intel's newer versions with the copper slug built in. But it was nice that WildBill sent this to us and basically said if you've got a use for it. And it was actually a very good time because we have a system which we've built, which is with an Intel i3-105F, and actually the stock cooler on it, although it's fine, it does the job and it keeps the temperatures relatively under control, it's bloody noisy. This thing is super quiet, so it made the obvious choice. So I figured what I'll do is do a video, introduce you to the cooler. Most of you have probably seen it already, but I want to take a kind of slightly nostalgic look at where we've come from in terms of compatibility and ease of use, all that kind of stuff, and actually have things changed much in terms of the actual technology, the quietness, ease of installation, all those kinds of things. So strap yourselves in, this could be a long one. So let's start off taking a look at the packaging on this one. So exterior wise, this is very typical Gelid type packaging. We've got Tranquillo Rev4. There's a few different versions of this available due to various kind of manufacturing techniques, etc. Each one slightly improving on the last. Now compatible with AM4 socket. So this would have been compatible straight out of the box with socket AM4 for AMD, which at the time was a big thing. This is released somewhere in the region of kind of 2016, possibly slightly before that. But at that time, we were coming out of the Intel dominant era, heading into the blurry-eyed world of the new AM4 socket, waiting for something a little bit different. So this was compatible with AM3, which was pretty much coming end of life at that time. It was also compatible, obviously, with AM3, looking at also FM1, FM2, AM2, AM2+, all those kinds of sockets. But now manufacturers had to change their gearing a little bit because the AM4 socket was slightly bigger. And I think another reason why I'm doing this video is because we're actually going to be heading very much into this kind of era all over again in 2022, 2023, when AMD's socket AM5 comes out. And we're probably going to see a repeat of this entire thing where people are going to start touting support for AM5 on the front of the box or having to send away for additional fitting kits, which actually for some people with the Gelid Tranquillo and many other coolers on the market, Cooler Master, all those kinds of things, you would have had to probably send away to get a AM4 fitting kit. I know for a fact I did with some thermal take coolers I had a while back. It was a very common thing to have those new additions which you could quite easily screw onto. So yeah, that was all well and good. You can get some idea of the kind of dating of this. So it says at the bottom, compatible with Intel sockets 775, 1366, 1150, 1151, 1155 and 1156. Obviously back then no mention of LGA 1200, although technically LGA 1200 fits anything which fits the 11.5x range. So in this particular era, some of the things which were very popular, obviously Cooler Master with their Hyper 212 and 212 Evo, all those kind of range, things like the Gamax 400, that was also starting to come out, I think. Maybe it was the 200, it was out with the 2 heat pipes. But realistically, if you wanted the cream of the crop back in the day, you'd be looking at a 4 heat pipe system. So this one had 4 power heat pipes, intelligent PWM curve. Again, this was something which was starting to become more mainstream. A lot of fans still would have been on VDC or DC or controlled by a voltage rather than actually having an intelligent PWM chip in there. You can probably tell some of the older fans because you'd get that kind of chirping noise. If you set the voltage a little bit too low or it was far too aggressive of a ramp up, they'd quite often you get a clicking noise where they switch between the different voltages. But now with the modern era, we don't have to worry about that so much. So this had the intelligent PWM curve on there. Silent operation, which again was something which was quite a big thing back then. We were used to really noisy fans, especially the stock coolers. That is something that Gelid have always done very well. Their fans are generally, even the smaller ones, are very, very quiet indeed. Also got high airflow. That was something as well they looked at, the actual spacing of the fin stacks. Whether or not it's a design thing or whether it's just a limitation of how the actual process is done, but the actual fin stacks were slightly wider apart than they tend to be on some other modern coolers, therefore letting airflow through nice and easy and letting it escape very quickly. You also had a dual layer fan blade. Now this is where I'm not entirely sure with this particular model, because as you can see on the box there, it does look pretty much identical to what we've got on the front there, although that says Tranquillo Rev4 on the sticker, whereas the one that we've been sent here actually says Tranquillo Rev2 on there. So I think at some point along the way, Bill's possibly changed the fan, or maybe this is how he got it and it was just, that was how it was. The fan cable on this being as long as it is leads me to believe that potentially this is a case fan which has been repurposed, but essentially kind of it does the same sort of thing. Still very quiet and has a really good RPM range, as it kind of says on the box there. So other things which we were getting back then, which possibly we don't often get quite as much now. Gelid had a thing at the time, 5-year warranty for pretty much most of their fans, which is always a good thing to see. The fitting kits are something which, because we were going again through that kind of evolutionary stage between AM2, AM3, AM4, and obviously the Intel chipsets changing, etc., there was a ton of brackets and stuff included, and it really was somewhat of a minefield. So let's take a look at some of the fittings that we get inside the box, and we'll go through some of the packaging. You can see actually from the packaging, it does kind of date itself quite well. Now, in some respects, we've got the instructions. Now, there's an instruction manual, which is a general one for Intel and AMD, and there's also an included one for AM4 as well, just because AM4 just was a completely different setup at the time. Bill also kindly included an additional set of clips to install an additional fan, should you need to. And this is, again, this is something which is very telling of the era. Back in sort of 2015, 2016, recycling and things like that were mostly for kind of hippies and beardies. Now, obviously, we're a little bit more kind of clued up on recycling and stuff, and we get either cardboard cartons or just basically less packaging in general, whereas the plastic clamshells, which this is, yeah, I haven't seen one of these in a really long time. Anyway, that's enough of the packaging. Let's take a look and look at this accessories kit. Now, obviously, it's going to be slightly different than what it would be if you were buying this as a brand spanking new cooler. And actually, you can still buy these as brand spanking new coolers from various places. They're not always the cheapest, which is possibly a sign of the quality and the manufacturing. When you actually look at this, even though it is only 6 years old or so, maybe slightly less, maybe slightly more, the actual manufacturing that goes into the coolers back then does seem to be of a much higher standard than it is for modern things. I guess with the economies of scale and also the bean counters trying to make things as cheaply as possible, but without them kind of literally falling apart when you first use them, you can definitely tell the difference. Even with this, with the heat sink on the side there and all the blades, they're actually pretty tough and they feel pretty solid. Whereas if you get one of these kind of typical 120mm tower style coolers from kind of like your AliExpresses, that sort of thing, the fins on them, generally you only kind of breathe on them and they start bending. So yeah, very well made, and it just looked like an engineered product rather than some mass produced thing. But anyway, onto the fittings. So this one, from what I can tell, doesn't actually have the AM4 fittings included, which actually was quite handy because we were going to be using it on Intel anyway. Shame really, because I could have actually done a comparison with one of the coolers I just tested yesterday, which I've still got the results fresh in my mind, so that would have been very handy. But not to worry, because we have used it on Intel and we've got some really good results, which you'll see a little bit later on in the video. Let's go through the packaging. So there's a set of 4 screws there. I'm not entirely sure if they are for this particular cooler or not, because there are 4 screws already in the base plate there, which currently is holding on the Intel mounting kit, which I've been using today for my testing. So there's a spare set of screws there for something, possibly not even related, I'm not entirely sure. Feel free to comment in the comment section below and let us know what the deal is with that. So let's start off with the back plate. So the back plate, again, because we're going through that stage of evolution, so this is a combo back plate. So if you're using the AM3 setup, then you'd use this section with that facing towards your motherboard. If you're using the Intel setup, so 775, 1366 and the 115X range, then you would use it with these 4 sections pressed against the back of the motherboard, and I'll show you some shots of this when it's actually installed so you can see what's going on there. We've got the 3 kind of cutouts actually on the legs there, and that is for the pins which you install it with. So let's take a quick look at those. I'll be honest with you, I am extremely thankful for this being sent to us. Don't take this the wrong way, but I hate this kit. I genuinely hate it. Installing it is an absolute pain, and it goes to show how we have actually come on, engineering has improved, simplicity has improved, etc. Once it's installed, don't get me wrong, it's absolutely rock solid. But actually taking it out of the packaging, looking through the instructions, Gelid's instructions aren't the best, I'll be honest. But this was one of those things where I was actually really confused, and I think for most people installing it, if you're somewhat of a novice, I think you'd struggle. So yeah, anyway. So you've got the 3 notches in there. There is a pin, and that has actually got some notches in it as well to keep it steady. So depending on which socket you're using, you just push those pins through. That would then push through the back of your motherboard, and then on the other side of the motherboard, you've got these little knurled thumb screw type things, which you just screw on the top, and screws all the way up. So effectively that would be your mounting system. If you're using AM3, not AM4, because I've tried this and it doesn't physically fit, so you'd flip it around the other side, you'd pass through your pin, same pin, put it through one of those top or bottom holes, turn it so it locks into position, and again you do the same thing with the same screws. Now it's quite good the fact that they've actually managed to make the screws and those kind of retaining sections the same size for both Intel and AM3. Saves obviously on extra packaging and extra bits of metal, etc. So yeah, I think that's actually a good idea. So combination backplate, AM3 and Intel all sorted in one go. If you're using AM4 with this cooler, then there is actually a separate fitting kit, in which case you retain the AM4 backplate and you just swap out these retaining screws. So effectively, if you were installing it normally, they would just go on. There's spring clips, so you just tighten that down as you would for most coolers in the 4 positions. Again, depending on which side you're doing it on, just screws on, cross-headed screwdriver, PH2, tighten it down so it won't go any further, and that is it. It's actually a really good mounting mechanism. It works very well. It's just a little bit kind of unclear when you're first looking at it. Once you've installed it, it all makes perfect sense. Again, when it comes to the actual CPU tower, or the cooling tower, so there's 4 screws in the bottom. If you're using AM3 or AM4, the AM4 brackets of these you'd have to get, they were slightly different because they were slightly further out. They do look very similar, but they are slightly different angle. So effectively you just undo the 4 screws there, take out those brackets, replace it with one of those brackets, put the screws back in, and the job is done. So that is the tower itself. The mounting clips for the fans, now these are one of those things where they're either an absolute joy or they're an absolute pain, depending on how lucky you are first time. So let's take one of these off and you can see what I mean. So actually just taking it off actually isn't particularly easy. Some people say, oh no, what's the matter with you? These are fine. But the thing is, they come off very, very easily. So depending where you're actually putting it in, if they're in a slightly tight place, it's kind of, yeah, it just wants to come off. Those could have been bended around a little bit more just to keep them, well, you can see, yeah, it's losing the will to live already. So let's take the other one off and we'll take a closer look at the actual fin stack. So fan wise, we're not going to get too involved with the fan. Again, this is a PWM fan. Really nice, what's that, 7 blades on there, very quiet. It doesn't say the model number on the back there, it just says it's DC 12 volts and gives you the RPM. So this one does up to 1500 RPM. It does go down to somewhere in the region of about 400 RPM at its lowest point. So yeah, I think due to the length of that cable, I think this possibly was a case fan. But anyway, it does the same job effectively. So the only thing that I did notice about it actually, saying that, is there doesn't appear to be any rubber dampening on any of the corners, which again, around about 2015, 2016, rubber dampeners or foam pads weren't always present anyway. Very few companies did. Probably one of the notable ones was probably Cooler Master with the Evo 212. Things like Gamax, the Gamax 400 from Deepcool, that definitely didn't have them. So yeah, there were some brands that did, some brands that didn't. I'm not too sure what Arctic were doing at the time. Not entirely sure. I think it was probably just before the Freezer 33, possibly. Not too sure on that, but anyway, if they had one, then possibly they had little stick-on pads which you could put on, which a lot of companies did. But anyway, there's not one there. I'm digressing again. So looking at the fin stack. Now you'll look at the fin stack and you'll think, well, that's a very elaborate pattern on there. Why would they bother doing that? Because obviously it's cutting into the metal and you're losing some of your potential cooling power. Now there is actually a very good reason for it, and the reason is because when this is in the AM3 or AM4 mode, So you've got the flat bracket on. You're probably seeing some B-roll of this. I shot a little bit earlier. It would have been almost impossible to get the screwdriver actually to the screwdriver heads to tighten it up. So by cutting out these sections here and here, and there, gives you access for a screwdriver so it can go down through this channel, which makes a lot of sense, and actually is something which a lot of companies have actually done the same thing as well. Even modern day coolers, which we've had in the last couple of weeks or months, very similar designs, although some people are getting around it by having wider fin stacks, but anyway, you get the idea. So 4 heat pipes on here, 4 copper heat pipes, which you can see they're clearly exposed copper, which again was very telling of that time, and even now some of the cheaper coolers in the market do have that exposed copper look. They don't bother nickel plating it or actually painting it black or anything like that. They just have it exactly as it is in that kind of bare metal design. Also on the bottom, the plate, you've got a little bit of a slight ridge to the bottom there for some heat dissipation, although realistically it's not going to do a great deal because there isn't much additional surface area there at all. But yeah, overall pretty decent. The bottom actually, the heat pipes, again, this is another telling time. Exposed heat pipes are still quite common, but actually having a gap in between them that you can actually kind of get your fingernail stuck into, that these days is becoming less and less common. We're now finding that these will be kind of either sanded or smoothed better, or maybe spaced apart and then put actually inside of another metal block to contain it all. So yeah, things have changed slightly. Some people still do it that way. I quite like the look of the exposed metal on there, I'll be honest with you. I think it's a very nice look, and it's actually been done to a very nice finish, considering this has probably been installed a good few times. It still is almost mirror finish on the bottom there. So again, testament to the kind of engineering and the build quality that we were experiencing 5-6 years ago. Okay, so that's enough of me whittering on. Let's take a look at some of the performance figures. So this is an unfair fight, I know that straight away, but I just want to see how big the difference actually is. So we're using the Intel i3 10105F LGA 1200 stock cooler, copper slug included. It's their new design, so it's actually not horrible, but does a relatively good job, but a little bit on the noisy side. In my testing, what I've done is there's 3 types of tests we've done. So the first is the raw performance numbers, both in the single shot deal, so just running Cinebench R23 once. Then we've also got the looped version, so that is going to look out for any discrepancies or any kind of drop off in performance, which you will definitely see, but as to how much of an extent that's going to be. And then also we're going to be looking at temperatures, both high and low. So first of all, let's start off with the results. So this is for the single pass. So in terms of the single pass with the stock cooler, we first got 5,372 points. And with the Gelid Tranquillo Rev4, we got 5,708. So that is actually a pretty decent gap of somewhere around about 300 points. This is generally better than what you'd get by just shutting down apps and background tasks, that kind of thing, closing OneDrive, those sorts of things. So definitely an improvement there. So let's take a look at the looped figures and see how that affects performance. So with the stock fan, loop performance wise, we've got 5,114 points. And with the Gelid Tranquillo, we actually dropped to almost the same, slightly less in fact, at 5,111 points. Now obviously Cinebench R23 is one of those things that if there is anything going on in the background, it will affect figures slightly, and even after a few passes I managed to get virtually the same results. So it does seem actually on an extended loop pass, it makes no difference to the actual scores themselves in that respect. So what we're seeing here is this particular processor is great for burst speeds, but for elongated stuff, essentially regardless of what cooler you're using, it makes very little difference. Where we are going to see a difference is obviously going to be in the temperatures and also the noise profile as well. So first of all, the noise profile, actually there's no point even putting a graph up on the screen because the Intel stock cooler has got a horrible sound profile to it. It generally has. It idle and under some moderate loads, it's absolutely fine. But I found it worse actually at startup. When you've got all those little processes in the background and things just starting up, it sounds hideous. It sounds way too loud considering, in theory, there's nothing open. You're not opening anything because it's literally started up. Whereas with the Gelid, completely better, virtually silent, even at that startup section. So yeah, it did sound much better. And it actually does make a big difference, the sound profile, in my opinion. Anyway, let's take a look at the highs and the lows. So this is again with Cinebench running. This is for an extended loop of 5 minutes to get a low and a high speed. I generally find that within the first 3 to 4 minutes, we normally get to our equilibrium where it doesn't change any much. So I don't see the point in running it much longer than that. So with the stock cooler, the lowest recorded temperature was 26 degrees Celsius. And this is actually weirdly in a 24 degrees Celsius room. So we're only 2 degrees above the ambient temperature, which actually for the Intel processor I think is excellent. Just shows that when they are at a point where they're just sipping a small amount of power, and I think the lowest I saw from the package was somewhere in the region of about 3 watts. So yeah, to be around about ambient temperature is absolutely fine. When we actually stressed it for an extended period, we did get up to 65 degrees Celsius, which is almost 100% of my fan curve. So the fan curve is the usual one I use, so 20% at 20C, 40% at 40C, 60% at 60C, and 100% at 70C. And I use that across the board for all my testing, so if you're looking back at any of our videos and even future ones, those will be the methodology that I use across the board, so easy to compare them. But anyway, so 65 degrees Celsius, almost hitting 100% on that Intel stock fan, which sounded like a screaming banshee. Not good at all. But the Gelid actually done much better. So we actually had a idle temperature of 22 degrees Celsius, which is weirdly 2 degrees below the ambient temperature. So yeah, that's good. I haven't seen that sort of thing since the old AM3 days with the Hyper 212 Evo on an old AM3 FX 4100, where it would weirdly read results which are way below the ambient temperature. But anyway, I digress. Where it's important is the high temperature. So we actually had something like 14 degrees difference. So we actually had a highest recorded temperature of 51 degrees Celsius. I think that's brilliant. 14 degrees difference between a stock cooler and a tower cooler is great. And as you can see, looking at the results, actually, there's a much wider spread. So with the stock cooler, we're looking at somewhere in the region of about 40 degrees Celsius between the lowest and the high. Whereas with this, we're looking at around about 30 degrees difference between the low and the high. So not only is it bringing the temperatures down, it's also reducing the range of those temperatures. So I think that's pretty much wrapping up my experiences with this particular cooler. I do like the way that they've actually made the blades white on the cooler. So in our RGB setup, even though the fan itself isn't RGB, it does reflect the RGB around it. So it does give the impression at a glance that there is actually some illumination on it, although there clearly isn't. So whether or not you're into RGB or whether you dislike it and you just want something a little bit more subtle, then it actually works in both ways, and that is very common with a lot of Gelid products where they do the contrast in black and white or black, white and chrome, so it does fit into most builds. Where I find the problem with this these days is if you look around at pricing, it's not one of the cheaper coolers on the market. Now, effectively, it's going to perform pretty much identical to the Evo 212 as it did back in the day, and obviously it's only going to be a few degrees difference between that and things like the Freezer 33, Freezer 34, and other numerous 120mm tower coolers that I could mention. They all do perform within a relatively narrow band of performance results. So ultimately it's going to be down to ease of use, installation, and looks. And I guess price to some extent if you're tight like me. So anyway, a very good cooler, very well made, and certainly looking back 5-6 years at a cooler which of this sort of age and era, yeah, it does make you think how good we had it back then. Although price wise now, it's something around about £35. Sometimes you can get them as low as 30, or on the used market maybe 15-20 quid. At those sort of prices, the new price I'm not entirely sure. I think I would probably go for something slightly more modern. Okay, let me know what you think in the comment section. But I think if you're looking at this, maybe you're seeing one on the used market on eBay or something, or maybe Facebook Marketplace, and it's somewhere between the 15 and 20 pounds mark. Yeah, I think it's definitely worth a shot. And if you can get over the kind of installation gripes and if you've got slightly more dexterity with these kind of clips, which I do tend to lose my patience with, I'll be honest with you, then I think it's definitely well worth a look. So thanks once again to WildBill for sending it over for us to take a look at. It's actually really cool to see something a little bit older. So if you've got any stuff lying around that you don't use anymore and you want it to go to a home, or you just want to send to us so we can check it out, and do get in touch with us. Email address and all contact details are in the video description. And obviously if you've got any comments, you know where to put them in the video description below. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.